Professor Tuddenham, I just wanted to pick up on the theme of paternalism. You mentioned that earlier in the context of the doctor's attitude towards consent in the context of research. And I just wanted to ask you to think about that principle, or that concept, when one's talking about treatment decisions. Would you accept as a matter of principle that patients should have been told about the risks of non-A, non-B hepatitis?
Yes.
And would you accept, again, as a matter of principle, that they should have been told about the risks of AIDS?
Yes.
Would you agree that one of the reasons, at least, why that's important is because if you've got a balance of risks, ultimately the judgment as to whether you run one risk or the other and expose yourself to that has got to be for the patient?
In most circumstances, yes.
So there may be firm advice and a firm view a doctor holds that they can impart to the patient.
Indeed, they can refuse. If they're Jehovah's Witnesses, they will have refused completely to have any blood product at all in that era.
Do you know, as a matter of fact, what information was given by Dr. Kernoff or your colleagues to patients in the 1978 to 85 period about the risks of non-A, non-B hepatitis or AIDS?
No. Conversations with patients that I can recall on the occasions when that arose, they were clearly aware, but to anyone who was reading the newspapers, it was, these things circulated, and the patient community were, it's not like today with the era, of course, of social media, but back then people were in touch with each other and the news circulated. But I wouldn't know what was said during annual review consultations.
Can I then just come to the question of pharmaceutical companies and their role briefly? You've described for us in your statement your relationship with Spaywood and then later on other pharmaceutical companies. Can I ask you to look at, there's a paragraph in your witness statement, paragraph 46. Again, could we have it on screen, Henry? It's WITN 3435002. And if we go to page 20, please. It's towards, in paragraph 46, the last 3 lines of the page, after you refer to there being a false sense of the risk-benefit ratio, you say this: once the demand for factor concentrate accelerated with more home treatment and some prophylaxis, the commercial incentive to make more and sell more seems to have overwhelmed the safety issues. Are you able to expand upon that observation?
I did slightly couch that in probable terms by putting seems in the middle of the sentence. There was clearly money to be made by producing factor concentrate. As more was being used to improve management of bleeding. And even by today's standards, it's still not very high now that we have prophylaxis aiming at trough levels which eliminate bleeding. But there was a steady rise in consumption per capita, per patient. And it's a valuable drug that sells at a high price. Currently there's a $10 billion industry in making factor 8. And back then it was smaller, but there was a demand and a commercial incentive. Did it overwhelm the safety issues? Well, when one looks at the sort of headlong rush to make more factor VIII, getting the plasma from wherever or whoever in those days of the late 70s, early 80s, I think it's fair to say that a commercial incentive did overwhelm the safety issues. Yes.
And I just want to refer you to the transcript of an interview you gave in 2016. It's JEVA 5011, I think. So this is an interview you gave on the 29th of September 2016. You watched a film, Bad Blood, A Cautionary Tale, and you were giving reflections on that. But then I wanted to just ask you for to look at some of the observations or comments you made about the pharmaceutical industry. So if we go to the second page, please, Henry. You say this, picking it up at line 13, you refer to the film and say, I think it's a film that should be required viewing for drug company executives in the field of blood products. It's a very important message to bear that as doctors, whilst trying to do our best for patients with our new technologies, there are increased risks and it should not be forgotten. And this thing will happen again, but we need to be alert to the possibility that we're making a mistake and be ever vigilant and take the most measures that we possibly can to be aware of new threats and to keep safety at the forefront. And then you go on to say at line 24, I think the commercial interest clearly outweighed best practice in safety, which is, I think, essentially the point you've just made. And then if we go to the next page, please. If we go to line 15, please, Henry. You say this. It's very difficult to be a paid consultant to a particular drug company and still keep completely independent in your thought. I know that because I've done consulting, and in many in the industry, and the standards now are certainly better for declaring interest than they used to be. You have to be completely transparent with the total amount of money that you receive and the fact that you're on consultation boards. It would be unusual for a very prominent researcher / medical doctor in the field not to be engaged with the companies who are making the treatments that we use, even only in an advisory capacity. And then you say this, so yeah, there can be conscious and unconscious bias. Just pausing there before we come on to the next part. Conscious bias is obviously pretty self-evident. What were you meaning when you talked about there might be unconscious bias on the part of a clinician?
I think that the evidence for that comes out of the amount of money that was being spent by the companies and on lavish entertainment.
And you go on to talk about that as being, at the bottom of the page, it was overwhelmingly lavish at various stages that I can recall. And then you say that you weren't so exposed to it because you took a very academic route, but I can see how it could influence people. And then you say this, why were they spending that money? You mean they're the pharmaceutical companies, I take it, Professor Tuddenham. The answer, because they could gain influence with it. And that's the purpose, presumably, of the interactions, the visits from the sales reps, whether it's the mugs, the funding of booklets or whatever. Pharmaceutical companies want doctors or hospitals to buy their product.
Yes.
And then you talk about some examples of lavish hospitality. You would be going to the best, to a conference on haemophilia, there would be the very best restaurants, the river cruises, all the paraphernalia of marketing products. It didn't go quite to the heights that it got in some areas with a bigger turnover, like, let's say, cardiology and gastrointestinal diseases, where people would go on cruises for for educational purposes and make hundreds of thousands of pounds out of it. But it was remarkably lavish. So that's from your direct knowledge of the way in which pharmaceutical companies interacted, is it?
Yes. Mm.
And then I've just got a number of specific questions raised by for participants, Professor Tuddenham, on a range of miscellaneous but important issues. You've told us about the stored samples of sera and the fact that Dr. Kernoff also stored samples of concentrate. Three questions arising out of that. Have those concentrates, to your knowledge, ever been tested?
I don't know. There was boxes and boxes of bottles of concentrate that came from each batch sitting in a cauldron at the Royal Free when I got back there in 2006, as were all the plasma and serum samples sitting in -80 refrigerators, which kept breaking down. They were the old ones. And at a certain point, when we'd had yet another meltdown of the that -80 fridges over a long weekend, and they're beginning to smell bad, we destroyed all the plasma and sera samples because they weren't any use anymore, and they'd become a biohazard. And I think the concentrate bottles went out at the same time, and I'm not aware that they had been tested. They may have been, I just don't know.
Did Dr. Kernoff store, as well as the samples of concentrate, any samples of cryoprecipitate that had been used?
No.
And do you know whether the samples of plasma, whether they were ever accessed by others, so not doctors within the Royal Free, but third parties, other organisations, other clinicians?
If so, it would only have been done with consent of an individual. As I mentioned previously, sometimes we were asked to do a look back and test samples, and I suppose that may have been sent out or supplied to somebody else. Not during my time there. If we were asked to check back, we did the testing.
You have described in your statement your work with Spaywood, and we've got various documents. I'm not going to ask you for the details of that. Did Spaywood products, were they used at the Royal Free?
Yes, indeed. The Hi8C, the high purity pig factorate, was used in our inhibitor patients for many years.
And
in fact, the very last batch was used on the patient who'd been treated back in 1986, sometime in the 2010, to cover a hip replacement, I think. Yeah.
I think we know from the ethical approval document we looked at earlier, there was intended to be a trial of Hi8C. Of the porcine product.
Yes.
And were you directly involved with that?
Yes.
Did you perceive there to be any conflict of interest as between the use of the product at the Centre for Patients and your own consultancy with the firm?
No, it was a unique product, and if a patient had anti-human factor VIII but didn't have anti-porcine, they were automatically highly suited for that product. My other involvement with Spaywood was in the project to purify human factor VIII for analysis and cloning and so on. Yeah.
Then going back to the treatment policy in the late 1970s, early 1980s, introduced by Dr. Kernoff, do you agree that there was a conscious decision to switch patients to concentrates from cryoprecipitate?
Yes.
That switch to concentrates included patients with mild or moderate as well as severe haemophilia?
Moderate, yes. If a mild patient was given a concentrate when there was an alternative, DDAVP, cryo, it should have been a conscious decision that there was a reason to do that the others would not have been appropriate after we'd realised the risks and the advice had come out. That again, as always, there's a kind of grey period when the risk wasn't fully appreciated and somebody might have just thought, well, in this particular circumstance, let's give the concentrate. And there is one case of that which I've given evidence on to an earlier phase of the inquiry where a patient had particularly resistant bleed and was given concentrate. But so there would be a decision, and it should in all instances have been considered. In clinical medicine, things happen at weekends when people are on call and who might not be familiar with the case, and you might get mistakes. And I guess there is going to be such instances. But as a general principle, by the time it was the case that we knew that there was more risk with concentrate to patients, such as mild patients who hadn't previously been exposed, then there should always have been a conscious decision and a good reason to give the concentrate.
And would you accept that the risk of transmission of hepatitis, of non-A, non-B hepatitis, was known, whatever might have been the view of the precise severity of it or its long-term consequences, that concentrates were highly likely, if not certain, to transmit non-A, non-B hepatitis was known by the late 1970s?
Yes.
Would you agree that it's reasonable to infer, therefore, that Dr. Kernoff must have been willing to take that risk?
Yes.
Just on DDAVP, were there ever any problems with supply of DDAVP that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of.
You mentioned in your statement some involvement in the Penrose inquiry.
Yes.
We've not currently been able to track down any documentation about that, and you didn't, I think, give oral evidence in any of their formal sessions. Could you just summarise what your involvement was, how it came about and what you did? I
gave response to their questions during the course of several hours. General questions about how we reach decisions to give particular treatments during the critical period, late 70s to mid 80s. If my evidence was not included in the report, which I think is what you're saying, then I'm not sure why not, but because I wasn't involved with the situation in Scotland, I was giving general background information, I guess, perhaps not of a sufficiently specific character to merit inclusion in their report.
And did you produce anything in writing, a report or statement, or was it a question of having a meeting and answering questions in person?
It was the latter.
You mentioned the if in doubt treat principle. How would that apply to patients who were previously untreated patients, PUPs, virgin haemophiliacs, or those who'd only received very minimal or infrequent treatment?
It would apply in the same way. But perhaps with a slightly higher bar on whether this was really likely to be a bleed, given that in mild and moderate patients bleeding is less frequent and usually only happens after significant trauma. If somebody with mild haemophilia falls 2 floors down onto concrete and has a headache, you're going to treat them. I mean, I'm thinking of a specific case, and he'd gone to the local casualty and been refused treatment, and his mother fortunately made him come to see us, and we treated him, but without any hesitation. It's like all clinical decisions, you've got to take account of all the circumstances.
And then just two final matters, I think, Professor Tuddenham. Could we have HSOC 2029583, please? This is an opinion you gave to the Haemophilia Society March 1987, and you were, I think, commenting in response to a request by the Mr. Waters of the Haemophilia Society on was it on the general litigation or on a specific individual's case? Can you recall?
Yes.
Was it general, a general observation about the litigation, or were you commenting on a specific individual?
It's a general observation.
And then you pose a number of questions. You say, was the government negligent in not accelerating self-sufficiency of home-produced factor 8? And you set out your opinion. You believe the government was negligent in that regard. But as pointed out, this falls within the area of discretion, and alternative supplies were procured. And by alternative supplies were procured, you mean commercial concentrates, presumably?
Yes.
And then would the provision of home-produced concentrate have reduced the number of HIV-infected patients? The answer here must very clearly be yes, despite the overcautious remarks of Professor Bloom in his Lancet editorial of 1984. He would himself now, I'm sure, agree that we would have half or less of the antibody-positive cases that we have now had UK factor 8 sufficiency been reached in 1977 as promised by the government of the day. That means that the bureaucratic discretion of the government's responsible for at least half of our antibody-positive cases. Does that remain your view?
Yes.
And then you pose a question about do individual patients have a prospect of proving negligence? And you say that might depend upon individual cases. And then if we go further down, I don't think I need to ask you about your comment at the end about legal aid or being able to afford court costs. Did you have any other involvement in the litigation that took place in the late 80s, at the beginning of the 1990s?
No, I didn't.
And then if we could go, please, to RLIT 5022. And could we go to page 76? So this is the witness seminar we looked at this morning. If we could go 10 pages further on. And if we could just go to the previous page to check that this is you speaking. Sorry, previous page still. I think it's fairly obvious it's you, but I just want to put it in context. We keep going back. It's obviously a long intervention of yours. We've gone too far back now.
It has all the details.
It does. I think, okay, we'll move forward to 76. It talks about Spaywood, so I'm fairly confident it's you, Professor Tuddenham. You say this in the second paragraph, third line. You say this: everything that we give to a patient has to be subjected to the most intense scrutiny. And that's the principle that you then go on to discuss in the context of recombinant. Would you agree that that should always be and have been a guiding principle when dealing with blood products, whether now or in the 1970s and 1980s?
Yes, I would, yes.
Professor Tuddenham, those are the questions I have for you. So I don't know whether, before I ask Professor Tuddenham if there's anything he wants to add, whether there's any questions you have.
Well, yes, I do. At the end of this inquiry, I shall have to consider making recommendations. That's recommendations as to what happens in the future. You have said in your evidence, you may well be right, that we just don't know what may be carried by blood in the future when that blood is transferred from one person to another person. And you've said that we ought to assure the safety of it. How would you suggest that were best achieved?
Firstly, by continuing careful and, where possible, intense surveillance of the response to existing and future products in people who receive them. We do have good systems for recording issue and tracing recipients of given blood donations, and that performed well in the more recent context of the prion disease, where it was possible to track everybody who'd received particular batches or products, even down to the individual level. That must be continued where we use blood products. And in my view, to the extent that we can, we should find ways to replace blood products with synthetic alternatives. The biotechnology industry has developed and advanced to the point where that can almost universally be applied. There's still a few examples where it has yet to be so applied, but there are occasions when there's nothing quite as good as the blood product itself because it's full of so many different agents. But we will never know what's coming along in the way of a future infective agent, so we have to preserve vigilance, but replace where we can with the products of the ingenuity of biotechnology. There are some blood products that currently are not replaceable. Red cells, platelets. These are produced in a phenomenally complex way within our bone marrows, with ways we've only latterly understood and are certainly not yet in a position to replace. So there will be a continuing need for such blood products, but our best way to guard against future risks and is to maintain vigilance.
Thank you very much.
Is there anything that you would wish to add, Professor Tuddenham?
Only my great regret that during that period our best efforts to improve the management of haemophilia should have resulted in this disaster, and I hope that we do learn from it to guard against any similar such catastrophic consequences by, as I've said, continuing vigilance and always being aware that we don't know it all and never will know it all, but we have to keep learning.
Thank you.
Well, can I thank you very much for the, if I may say so, clear, considered, thoughtful and balanced way that you have given your evidence. I have to say, you've given me the impression that you've come with no particular agenda to pursue other than helping the inquiry to the best of your ability. And I would like to pay testament to that and thank you very much for coming to give your evidence. And I suspect you probably regarded it as your duty to do so. You've achieved it, and it may well be that, as I think your counsel may be aware, there may be some further questions to be addressed in writing in due course. And I hope that you will help us with that too.
Yes.
Thank you.
So that's it for hearings this week. And then we reconvene on Tuesday to look at Birmingham. There'll be a presentation in relation to Birmingham Children's Hospital. Then we'll hear evidence from Professor Franklin on Tuesday, probably running into Wednesday. Then from Dr. Wild, so still Birmingham. And then on Thursday from Dr. Parapia, Bradford.
Yes, so it's 10 o'clock on Tuesday.
10 o'clock on Tuesday.
10 o'clock on Tuesday for those of you who are coming back next week. Stay safe.